More people are talking about mold illness than they were 10 or 20 years ago. And part of that is because we are finally getting better at recognizing the health effects of damp and water damaged buildings. But better recognition isn't the whole explanation. We're also seeing more mold illness because of the way we build modern homes, and also because our bodies are becoming more susceptible to toxic overload. I'm Dr. Karen Curitan. I'm a naturopathic doctor specializing in mold illness and nervous system health. And I have also lived through toxic mold exposure and illness myself. And today I want to talk about why toxic mold illness is becoming more common and, in many cases, more severe. So, at this point, many doctors, including myself, who specialize in complex chronic illness, find that toxic mold is one of the top drivers of a wide array of chronic illnesses, including everything from skin conditions like eczema and psoriasis that are chronic to chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic digestive problems of all kinds, chronic sinus symptoms and allergies, headaches, migraines, autoimmune conditions of almost every kind, food and chemical sensitivities, mast cell activation disorder and histamine intolerance, chronic infections, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, and so much more. And like I said, while we definitely have gotten dramatically better at diagnosing mold related illness over especially the last decade, that's not the only thing going on here. Some of the chronic health conditions that we're finding as being triggered by toxic mold were quite uncommon until pretty recently. Things like mast cell activation syndrome, histamine intolerance, PANDAS, chronic SIBO, chronic Lyme disease, multiple chemical sensitivities, and others. So it's my belief that we're actually seeing more cases of toxic mold illness and that many of those cases are becoming more severe. And in this video, I'm going to explain why. It comes down to two main things. One, the way we've been building our buildings has changed dramatically since the 1970s in ways that made our buildings more susceptible to toxic mold growth. And two, we're becoming less healthy as a population overall and more susceptible to getting sicker from mold than we might have otherwise. And I'll talk about the reasons underlying that. But let's start with our buildings. Something that sadly most homeowners never hear until it's too late is that most modern homes are built in a way that make moisture problems likely. In fact, a 2007 peer-reviewed analysis by David Mudari of the EPA and William Fisk of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory reviewed several U.S. housing studies and found in the largest individual study covering 12,842 homes in 24 U.S. and Canadian cities, dampness or mold in 50% of homes. And unfortunately, on top of most modern homes being very moisture prone, they're also built with mold food. Mold loves to eat things like soft woods, wood pulp, and paper. And that is what we're using as primary components of construction today. And we know that when moisture gets trapped with a food source, mold will grow. So, due to the way homes are built in recent history, we're seeing more toxic mold illness. Prior to modern building practices, homes were actually much more mold resistant. And I'm going to get into why that is. Before I go deeper, I want to be very clear. Mold isn't new, of course. Moisture is not new. We've always had rain and humidity and roof leaks. And in fact, we've known about the harmful health effects of toxic mold when it is indoors since at least biblical times. In Leviticus 14, it basically says, if mold is found inside someone's home, the priest must order the contaminated stones to be torn out and thrown in an unclean place outside the town. He must have all the inside walls of the house scraped, and the material that's scraped off must also be dumped into that unclean place outside of town. Then they are to take other stones to replace these and take new clay and plaster the house afresh. And if the defiling mold reappears in the house after the stones have been torn out and the house scraped and replastered, the house must be torn down. Its stones and all the plaster and everything else must be taken out of town and dumped in the unclean place. So, that being said, what is new is that we are having quite an epidemic of hidden toxic mold in our homes in the last 40 to 50 years. And therefore, we're also seeing a growing incidence of toxic mold illness. And so let's get into the simple reason for this, that the way we build our homes today is just fundamentally different from the way homes were built for most of human history. Let's compare. Homes built around 1900 and especially before then used materials and methods that managed moisture better in a variety of ways. Those houses were built with plaster walls instead of paper faced drywall. Plaster is an inorganic material that mold doesn't like to eat. Paper on modern faced drywall is just about the most readily available food source possible for mold. Homes were also built with full dimension old growth lumber, which was much denser and more rot resistant than today's engineered lumber. Wood can also be a food source for mold when combined with moisture, but the quality and hardness and processing of the wood seems to make a difference in whether or not it's easy food for mold. And homes were also often made out of things like stone and clay and adobe in many regions. And these mineral based materials are not food sources themselves, typically for mold. They generally have a high alkaline pH, which molds do not like to grow on or in. Mass walls, meaning walls without cavities inside, just thick walls that are continuous, have no hidden cavities inside them where moisture can get trapped and mold can grow without ever being seen. So that was a more common type of wall system a long time ago when we were building out of things like stone and clay and adobe. Walls in modern stick built homes all have hidden cavities that contain wood, OSB, or strand board, basically wood pulp glued together into a board, and paper backed drywall, which are very readily available food sources that feed the mold where moisture gets trapped. And so, mold in modern homes is often growing behind walls, under floors, and we can't see it because we've got these hidden spaces in our homes now. Older homes were also typically built with gypsum lath and plaster, and those allowed air movement within the walls. So if moisture did get in there, it wasn't trapped. And so the walls were naturally ventilated wall assemblies. And now we use things like vapor barriers, and that can really trap moisture once it gets into these wall assemblies and make it more likely that mold's going to grow. Back in the day, they also used different kinds of stone foundations that could get damp and dry out more readily than our concrete foundations can now. They also had usually very simple roof lines with very few penetration points. Now we build these crazy roofs that have all these recessed areas that funnel water right down onto the wall. And so a lot of people end up with roof leaks because, frankly, their roofs are just too complex and they're not draining well. And so they end up having leaks. Also, older homes didn't have air conditioning, right? Air conditioning is a very modern development. And air conditioning units are actually an extremely common source for toxic mold in the home because it loves to grow on the perpetually wet coil inside, because that coil also usually has a lot of dust and dander and things like that on it from the air blowing over it. And so mold there has a food source and water and oxygen, and it has everything it needs. And so once mold does grow there, then it gets blown all over the house. Back in the day, people just opened their windows for cross ventilation, which meant if there was a toxic issue in the building, and it was building up in the home, clean air was coming in regularly to dilute that. And along with our modern HVAC systems, we've also installed complicated ductwork. And these ducts can also trap and recirculate mold all over the house. And they can actually cause moisture to be drawn into the walls from the outside due to pressure imbalances in HVAC systems that sometimes are not designed correctly. And if there is a leak in a duct that's going through a crawl space or an attic, mold spores or dampness from those places can actually get sucked into the ductwork and get circulated into the home. If the ductwork is a very different temperature than the air surrounding it, you can also have condensation inside the ductwork. So you can have the moisture and mold actually growing in the ducts on the surface of the ducts themselves because there's plenty of dust for the mold to eat in there. And certain types of ductwork are almost impossible to clean. So if there is a mold event in the home, the accordion style of ductwork often has to be replaced to get the home back to a healthy state, which can be really expensive, unfortunately. But older homes could get wet, and they did, but they were built in ways that allowed them to dry more easily, and they were built with less of mold's favorite foods, so they didn't become petri dishes for mold. So when a 1905 house leaked, the water often evaporated because the assembly wasn't made of moisture holding sponge like materials and then sealed in with moisture barriers. But now we build with spongy mold food, things like OSB and strand board, paper faced drywall, and soft woods. So mold has all of its food there, and the moisture is getting trapped in places we don't want it to be. And not just from leaks, sometimes just from condensation or from moisture being pulled through the wall assembly from the outside in or from the inside out through outlets and things like that when humidity is really high, outdoor or indoors. And so, all kinds of reasons are leading to why we're getting moisture trapped inside these cavities in wall spaces where there's plenty of food in modern homes for mold to eat. And then if we go even further back to pre-1900 homes, traditionally, in most places around the world, homes were being built with stone, solid brick, adobe, heavy timber in some circumstances, lime plasters, and clay plasters. And yeah, these materials are incredibly mold resistant because they are either non-organic in the case of all of these mineral-based things or minimally organic, so they're not mold food. Also, many of these non-organic materials had great properties that could absorb and release moisture without causing rot or degradation or microbial growth. So a 300-year-old stone farmhouse might experience dampness, but it is much less common for it to grow toxic mold the way a modern wall cavity does, because there's no hidden cavity filled with paper and wood chips, essentially. It wasn't impossible for it to grow mold, especially on the surface of those stones, but it wasn't going to rot the entire wall, right? Moisture would pass through these buildings through cracks between the stones and around the door frames. And so they were drying out regularly on a natural basis. There was no plastic trapping moisture inside. So airflow, breathability, and inorganic materials made these structures more naturally resilient. And then, of course, there's modern plumbing. Nearly half of all US homes in the 1940s still didn't have running water or plumbing in the house. And that, of course, reduced the chance of a water leak indoors, right? And then by 1960, only about a sixth of US homes still lacked complete indoor plumbing and facilities. So, really, between about 1940 and 1960, we had a huge development of most homes, now almost all homes, having plumbing indoors. And that, of course, led to more problems, especially in wood based and drywall based homes. And then, even more recently, not only did we run plumbing to sinks, toilets, and tubs, but then we also added other more potential hidden leak sources inside, including washing machines, refrigerator water dispensers, dishwashers, and probably some others that I'm forgetting. So, contrast all of those traditional construction methods with modern construction, which really started around the 1970s. Around the 1970s is really when we started replacing plastered walls with paper-faced drywall, replacing solid plywood with OSB, otherwise known as strand board, and engineered lumber, then replaced old growth wood. This is when we started filling every cavity with synthetic insulation and limiting airflow, adding complex HVAC systems, which changed the pressure in the home, and depending on how the house was pressurized at any given time based on those mechanical systems, now we could get water being pulled into a wall system from outside or pushed into a wall system from inside. This is when we really started adding plastic vapor barriers, building tighter building envelopes, which trapped humidity inside and reduced the drying potential of wall cavities to very little. And all of these were introduced and became more and more common starting in the 1970s for cost savings, for speed of construction, and for energy efficiency, not for durability or for health of occupants. And almost all of these developments in modern construction that started around that time trap moisture and feed mold growth. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that the way we're building homes is contributing to why we're seeing mold illness so much more commonly now. And as you can imagine, a new built home in the 1970s may not have had any issues, but like all modern homes, they don't necessarily have a mold issue right away or a moisture issue right away. Sometimes it develops over time, right? And so these 1970s homes that may have remained healthy for a while then had leaks or had condensation issues over time. The bathroom fan broke and nobody fixed it. And so they started to have major humidity issues, or the caulking around the tub failed and nobody knew about it, or they added an air conditioning system and nobody knew that those things were supposed to be cleaned regularly. So all these things can kind of compound in a home over time, especially when nobody knows that there are going to be potential reasons that the house could become unhealthy for its occupants. So I think that many of these homes built 1970 and after, more and more and more of them are having problems with moisture and toxic mold growth. And that's why we're seeing this explosion in mold illness today. So when you see people online saying, homes never used to have these mold problems, what's going on? There is truth in that to some degree, because we replaced breathable mold resistant assemblies with sealed moisture trapping systems full of organic materials and mechanical systems that often make matters worse, right? And so that shift is the reason families all over the world are now suffering with mold related illnesses from homes that may still look pretty good superficially, because the issues that are going on in them are often hidden. And unfortunately, many brand new homes are having toxic mold problems from the get go because they're built with mold food, right? Wood, and they're allowed to get wet during the building process. The lumber often is not even inspected before the home is built with it. And sometimes it comes with mold growing on it. And then it's allowed to get even wetter during the building process. And that wood but doesn't always get to dry out completely before it gets trapped inside of vapor barriers and other layers. And so the mold spores that were already present on the wood, they just needed water to grow. So now you've got toxic mold growing hidden inside the walls of a brand new building. And these conventionally built modern homes are also pretty toxic even before mold enters the picture, because they are off-gassing a lot of chemicals from the building materials themselves. Yes, volatile organic compounds aren't just in certain paints. They're in the OSB, they're in the flooring, they're in all kinds of other materials that are usually present in newer homes, because we started adding chemicals to everything to make those products perform better in some way, shape, or form. And then those chemicals get trapped inside with occupants too, and they can also make people pretty sick. Some experts think it's the combination of this high chemical toxin exposure along with mycotoxin exposure that's making people sicker than before. So you can have a combined effect in the human being of those toxins, but also those chemical toxins can be toxic and aggravating to mold, which is also a living organism. And what do microbes do when they feel threatened? They fortify and defend themselves. So they create stronger biofilms, become resistant to antifungals, and they secrete more mycotoxins to defend themselves. Now, I'm not saying that you cannot build a more mold resilient and healthy stick built home. You absolutely can, but it takes a lot of changes to the materials and to the way that you assemble everything. And it takes a lot of attention to detail to be done optimally. To learn more about how to do this, I recommend Jen Jobart's course, Building a Healthy and Resilient Home. I'll link to it below. I took this course because my husband and I are building a mold resistant healthy home ourselves. Not a stick built home, but even so, there were some really helpful things we learned in that course about how to appropriately assemble and waterproof a foundation and roof, and a lot of details about mechanical systems. It's a really very in-depth course, and I recommend anyone who's considering building a home take that course. But aside from trying to improve upon stick-built homes, you can also go back to more historical ways of building with inorganic materials, with natural ventilation, and other modifications to make it more mold resilient. And this is what my husband and I are striving to do after going through several remediations in 2 different conventionally built homes in the last 5 years. Yeah, it's expensive, it's stressful, it's a lot to go through, and if you've already been through it a couple of times, you probably know what I'm talking about, and you don't ever wanna go through that again. So, there are other ways to do this. Healthier building systems are making a comeback. Inorganic and non-toxic materials are being used again, and even new non-toxic inorganic materials are being developed, such as perlite blocks, mineral wool, magnesium oxide boards, lime plaster, cement, metal. People are using all these other kinds of things that are not so much mold foods to construct mold resistant homes. Mass wall systems are coming back into style. These are ones where there are no cavities inside where mold can grow unseen, and they don't require additional insulation. So there's nowhere for humidity to get trapped. So these are things like System 3E blocks, hummuscrete, lavacrete, rammed earth walls, those kinds of things. Fresh air ventilation systems are an awesome modern development. Things like HRVs and ERVs are becoming standard in modern buildings, which I think is fantastic, especially because modern buildings tend to be built so airtight. HRVs and ERVs are mechanical systems that bring fresh air in from the outside continuously, while also either heating or cooling that air slightly so it doesn't affect your energy bills too dramatically. And then just really changing the way we're designing floor plans and roof plans and insulation. There are ways that you can minimize the need for air conditioning or even eliminate it altogether in some climates. And then also heating systems that don't require ductwork where dust and mold can collect are definitely an option. Some people are choosing to go with exposed copper plumbing indoors so that they know if a leak occurs, it's not hidden behind a wall. You can also have whole house leak detection systems that automatically shut off the water if a leak is detected, and so much more. So, if you or someone you love has gotten sick from toxic mold and you want to reduce your chances of facing it again, building an unconventional home that reduces the food for mold, hidden cavities where mold can grow, sources for leaks, etc., that's one potential path. And when it comes to our bodies, let's talk about how our bodies are also a contributing factor to why people are getting sicker from mold toxicity today than maybe they did before. When it comes to our bodies, we can make these more resilient to toxic mold too. That doesn't mean We'll be invincible in the face of mold toxicity, but we can improve our chances of getting a lot less sick if we have a big exposure at home or at work again. Because the truth is, in the US especially, we're getting a lot less healthy than even our parents, our grandparents, and our great grandparents. Well, why is that? Number one is we're being exposed to so many more toxins than prior generations in our food, in our water, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, cleaning products, building materials in our homes, and for so many other reasons. The EPA's Toxic Substances Control Act inventory was created from reports of chemicals in US commerce beginning in 1975, and in its 1982 edition contained approximately 62,000 substances. And the latest inventory contains 86,700 substances. So between 1975 and the latest inventory, almost 25,000 additional chemicals were added to the list of chemicals that have been used in the US. So they listed only 42,000 of them as being active, but that's still a lot of chemicals we're all being exposed to, right? And we don't know the effects of most of them. We do not really know the effects of those on our system. But what we do know is that if our body is having to detoxify them, that means our detoxification systems are bogged down and our cells are far more stressed than they used to be by these other toxins. So when mold toxins enter the picture, it's a lot harder for the system to keep up with getting them out and keep up antioxidant defenses and cellular repair and all of these things. The second main reason is because our microbiomes are less robust and diverse than they used to be. And actually, our microbiomes, if they are healthy, can help us break down mycotoxins. But rampant antibiotic use for the last number of decades has really decimated the average person's microbiome and therefore weakened our resilience to toxic mold. The third reason is that we as a population are so much more psychologically stressed than ever before. Yes, stress and nervous system regulation have an enormous impact on detoxification, immune function, sleep, cellular repair, and so much more that is needed to be resilient in the face of a toxic exposure, like toxic mold. And the fourth main reason is that our modern diet predisposes us to mold illness in a variety of ways. By not containing enough essential nutrients, by adding chemicals and non-food toxins and irritants to the food that we're eating, and by eating way too much sugar and carbohydrates, which are mold's favorite food. So, for a much more complete list of what makes us more susceptible to toxic mold illness, check out my video called Mold Illness Susceptibility: Why One Person Gets Sicker Than Another. That's where I go deeper into this topic, and I'll leave the link on screen at the end of this video. So there you have it, the two main reasons toxic mold illness has become so common today and is showing no signs of slowing down. If this video was interesting to you, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more content like this. Share it with somebody else who needs to see it. And leave me a comment below if you think there's something else contributing to why mold illness has become so common. Put it in the comments below. If you have questions on this topic, put it in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And I will also leave some helpful links for you in the description box below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.